Yes, it's fun by the elite academic types in America to say McDonald's is the wrong kind of food and it's the wrong kind of this and the jobs don't pay very much and so forth. I have quite a different view. I think McDonald's is one of the most successful educational institutions in the United States. They take people and give them a first job, which enables them to get a second job. They do a very, very good job of educating troubled young people to be good citizens, and they're probably more successful than charter schools.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Billionaire Charles Thomas Munger, Berkshire Hathaway fame. That much better than McDonald's, better than charter schools. Figure that one out. And I guess, look, if that's the kind of economy you want to have, then yes, McDonald's is a great educational institution and one that our inner cities should have. And fortunately, and with our last conversation, and you look at what the NAACP did, which only in my view was the call for accountability and transparency, and if charters and public schools are going to compete together, actually be judged on the same plane. If that is too far, then wow, because I would say stop them entirely, because here in Pennsylvania, the cyber charters have been an abysmal failure, as have a majority, in my view, of the other schools. It's just, got to tell you, it's insane what we've allowed to have happen. And that's why I've asked Professor Julian Vasquez Heilig to come talk with us. He's an NAACP leader there in California, also professor of educational leadership and policy studies, and the director of the doctorate in educational leadership at California State University there in Sacramento. Professor, thanks for taking time for us.
Always a pleasure to be back on your show. Thanks for having me again.
So I'm looking at this NAACP moratorium, which I got to be honest, I think is sane, it's rational, and it isn't. I don't think it's all that far, even though John King, the Secretary of Education, has said that this is just a bridge too far, and that there are really good charter schools, and we're just killing the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you should know about John King is that he is affiliated with a charter school on the East Coast that is responsible for extraordinary levels of suspension and expulsions. And the secretary recently gave that same charter school $10 million. And we know that the federal government has spent about $3.3 billion on charter schools over the last few years, and charter schools have doubled. And I think that's really an important thing we should consider. Charter schools really only educate about 5% of the nation's 50 million children. But what we see is a disproportionate share of new public money and foundation money going to these privately controlled schools. So what we haven't really talked about is where's this whole charter school thing going? First, let me go to the past real quick and then go to the future. So in the past, charter schools, the idea actually came from unions. A lot of people don't realize that, but Albert Shanker. But see, his vision for charter schools was that they would be more democratic, that teachers and communities would be the voices in those schools, that they'd be more democratic. But about 5 or 6 years later, he discovered that corporations and charter management organizations were starting to take over the conversation, and charters were actually becoming about, as Jitsu Brown just said, locking out the voices of community. So then let's just go to the future. We know in Pennsylvania, for example, that there are a lot of school districts that are teetering on the brink of bankruptcy.
Yep.
Because we haven't really thought this through. Because if you're creating a whole bunch of competitors for traditional public districts, what's happening is that you lose the economies of scale financially for districts in terms of food services and busing and all these other things. And so what's happening is in Pennsylvania and many other places, school districts are on the brink of bankruptcy. And in the community that my parents grew up in, Buena Vista in Saginaw, Michigan, the district went out of business there because charter schools put them out of business. And so we have to think about, what does the future look like? Do we really want a privately controlled system of public education? Is that what our vision is for education?
Well, some people would say that these public schools are an abysmal failure because we hear on the news every so often how bad the public schools are, and in fact, I look at some of the studies being done, and it's a lot like Congress. We think Congress is bad, but our guy's good. Same thing. The public schools are horrible, but our public schools, our teachers are great. Well, it's those teachers.
Well, it turns out that our public schools, especially in particular states, are doing quite well. And what's interesting is that they're actually targeting our top performing states with charter schools now. You see them targeting Maine, you see them targeting Massachusetts, you see them targeting North Carolina. These are 5 of our top performing states in terms of public education. If they were countries in the world, there would only be 5 or 6 countries that would outperform them if these states were countries. And so the problem is not our public education system in general. The problem is, as Jitu Brown talked about, is the inequity in our system. And, across the tracks, they have small class sizes. They have high-quality teachers, et cetera, et cetera. Martin Luther King once said that when it comes to public policy, we have socialism for the rich and rugged market capitalism for the poor. And so what we really have is a tale of two systems, is that we know that on purpose, poor children, whether they be white, African-American, Latino, Asian, Native American, that they're underserved by our society on purpose. That's really the elephant in the room. So, our public education system is not in disarray. What's in disarray is where we've decided to sabotage schools in particular communities and in particular places. There are many, many examples of high-quality public schools, and as Jitu talked about, only 1 in 5 charter schools, and that's Credo's work, show that outperform traditional public schools. And oftentimes they talk about the Credo studies. There's a more recent 2015 study, and the size of the impact of charter schools is in the hundredths of a standard deviation for African Americans. And so really we know what works in education. There really isn't any mystery. And I think that's one of the things NAACP said in their 2014 resolution, because what a lot of people don't realize, and actually I should say this too, my views don't necessarily represent that of my university or the California NAACP. I'm going to do my best to talk from the research today. And so what we know from the research literature is that, charter schools don't perform necessarily better than traditional public schools in the research. But we also find them to be more segregated. You're talking about in your last session that 30% of kids in charter schools are white, which is true. Now, here's the thing. I was just in D.C. a couple of days ago. There are charter school chains, and a lot of people don't actually talk about this. There are charter school chains that are segregated for white kids, such as Great Hearts in Arizona and in Texas. They only put their charter schools in wealthy and middle-class neighborhoods, and they teach from the quote-unquote classics. There's a research study in 2013 said they only had 4 English language learners in all of their charter schools. And what's interesting about those schools is we often talk about the creaming that happens, the cherry-picking of students. Well, that actually even happens to white kids in charter schools. The Great Heart schools, there was a Teachers College record peer-reviewed study that showed that only 50% of white kids that were middle class or upper middle class made it to the senior year from the 9th grade year. So charter schools, even with white kids, are segregated, and they're cherry-picking even white kids. So, I think what the NAACP resolution says is if you actually read the resolution, and I think, let me just tell your listeners something that probably other people don't know. That resolution did come from, from California. And when I spoke with the chapter that submitted it, they actually said that the moratorium was inspired by Journey for Justice and inspired by Black Lives Matter. So when folks say that the NAACP is out of touch, the resolution, when it came from the membership, was actually inspired by parents' voices in those grassroots organizations. So the fact that they're saying I think the argument is actually the opposite, that the NAACP is actually very in touch because of all the voices from Journey for Justice representing urban communities across the United States and Black Lives Matter, which have called for this moratorium. So I think that's also important to say.
I think it's extremely important. And at the end of the day, as I said earlier, I don't think what they're calling for is too far out of bounds. When you're looking at transparency and accountability and being judged on apples and apples and oranges, I don't think that's outrageous.
Right. And so the thing is, one of the things that, I think everybody has a favorite charter school. Let's just be honest. Everyone has a charter school that they say, yeah, I like that charter school. And, under full confession, I was an instructor at a charter school. I've donated to a charter school. I was on a charter school board. I was a charter school parent. I volunteered in a charter school in Minnesota in the 1990s, in the very early years. But I think it's important for us to take a close look and maybe change our mind as a society, because if you look carefully at the NAACP resolution, what it says is there's a series of civil rights violations occurring against students that are attending charter schools, and we must address those. And why charter school supporters are tone deaf to the fact that there are civil rights violations occurring. Now, let me go back to my original comment, which is that there are some good charter schools, but the thing is that the good charter schools are protecting the bad apple charter schools. And when Reverend Barber, who's the NAACP president from North Carolina, he said in the Democratic Convention that when there's injustice, that we're all responsible. And so the fact that the good apple charter schools are defending all of this malfeasance, the segregation, the cherry picking, the profit taking on the backs of black and brown children, the fact that that's occurring and the good apple charter schools are allowing the bad apple charter schools to do that through their lobbying associations. For example, in California, the Charter School Association has given $30 million to this point in the election. They have a $150 million war chest to dole out money to folks that are in support of market-based charter schools. And so I think that it's important that even if you have a favorite charter school, if they're not speaking out to their lobbyists, saying that the transparency and accountability legislation that we have not been able to pass here in California and in many other states, then they're also responsible.
Yeah, I'm with you. But at the end of this, to me, it's about reclaiming the public dollar. Because, I see all of these stories of, and again, I go back to the original intent of charter schools that I supported.
Sure.
You're talking about public dollars being put into place to try new things and to innovate and best practices to be shared. And what's happened is you now have all of these privatized entities who took what our tax dollars created, and now they're charging us for it. And at exorbitant rates out of the money that would have gone to our public schools, and you're really creating two systems, especially in areas of high poverty, that can afford it the absolute least.
That's right. And the thing is that if the original vision of charters, which was teacher-run schools and community-run schools, not run by corporations or private management organizations, then you would see that sort of collaboration. But because management organizations and for-profit companies and online companies, just a whole slew of different, because when we say charter schools, it's like saying car, because there's Hyundais and there's Lexus and there's the word charter is almost meaningless because there's so many different types of charter schools, online charters, for-profit, et cetera. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the reason why you don't see the sharing of innovative ideas is because these are now competitors. Why would Walmart sit down and have a powwow with Meyer Thrifty Acres or Kroger? Why would they sit down and have a powwow? Because what's happened is the charter school has evolved to a market-based competitive approach rather than a democratically driven, teacher-based, community-led approach.
That's an excellent point. But here's the question that people will then throw back at you. We've tried a lot of things. I go back to when I was a kid, and like I said earlier, I grew up in a housing project on the west side of Cleveland. They decided that the silver bullet to fix our educational achievement problems and racial diversity was to put us on buses and drive us all over the place. That didn't work. That was an abysmal failure. Kids kept failing. Now we're trying the charter schools. That's not working. There are those who would say, education's just not possible in poverty areas. Because at any rate, with community schools or with charters, but charters are our best way to go. What's the answer to that?
Well, you toss a lot in there, Rick. So let me just address two things. One, I don't think that to desegregate our schools, we're going to have to think about ways that children of different types would go to school together. Now, I know there was a lot of opposition to busing. There's a lot of opposition to busing in New Orleans because kids have to be on the bus for hours and hours. But there are places like Berkeley that have used SES to desegregate their schools. But most communities haven't expressed the willpower for poor kids and rich kids and kids of different types to go to school together. That's one of the questions we have to ask ourselves as a society. Do we want to remain a segregated, balkanized society, or do we want to find ways to integrate our schools? We are more segregated now than we were 60 years ago with Brown v. Board. It's now just de facto segregation instead of de jure segregation. I think on the second piece, which is what the silver bullets, clearly our schools represent the inequality and the poverty. I was at Stanford University for an inequality conference 2 days ago. And they showed a graph with every single district in the United States on it, every single district, more than 12,000 districts. And they also showed the wealth of those districts. And what it showed is that a straight correlation line that the more wealth a district had, the higher the test scores. I mean, that is the elephant in the room, is the inequality in our system. That being said, I want to take you all the way back to Aristotle, and you're probably not thinking we're going to go there, but go all the way back to Aristotle, and there was a debate about democracy. The idea of that form of governance was created, which was, should we have less inequality in our public policy or less democracy in our public policy? And as that has been the tension for the last 1,000 years in our conversation about democracy. So the thing is that the charter school conversation is about less democracy in school rather than focusing on the inequality in our society. Now, how do we address that? With community-based, more democratic approaches. You mentioned one of them. It's community schools. They're also called Comer schools. They've been around for decades. The idea is schools that have wraparound services to address the challenges that kids in poverty bring to the school. Inter-district charters is another form of democratically controlled choice. Magnets are, like you see 500 magnet schools in Miami that are very successful, another form of democratically controlled choice. I don't think anyone is against parent choice. What folks are against is privately controlled choice. People want to have choice where they have a say in what happens in those schools.
That's an excellent point. And it's perfect the way you put it there, because look, I'm not against the idea of trying different things. I mean, I wish I had some options to send my kids to. Like, I'm a big fan of the Montessori method, the right. hands-on stuff. I wish there was an option for that. I think all parents should have those options. It's just that the options that a lot of times we're given are not all that great.
That's right. And so the thing is that Milton Friedman, who could be thought of as the godfather of education choice, market-based choice, when he created these ideas, he was an academic, a white academic in Chicago in the 1950s, he said, we're going to create school choice so we can perpetuate segregation. So the idea of school choice was so that they could keep the school separate and unequal. That was the reason why these ideas, vouchers, were invented, why market-based choice was invented. But we've magically retrograded this idea that we can create equity using a system that was created to be discriminatory. And so we wonder why we see more segregated schools and why we see only black and brown kids going to certain type of no-excuse charters, et cetera, is because that is why these policies were created. They weren't created for reasons of equity. These policies, market-based choice, were created for reasons of inequity.
So at the end of the day, what you're really talking about is not even so much about schools as it is about our economy and making sure that people have access to jobs. Because to me, that's the answer in all of this. And I go back to A. Philip Randolph, who didn't want welfare programs. He wanted jobs programs. And I'm still of that mindset. As a kid, as I said, who grew up in the projects, the worst thing in the world was having to use that clown money to go to the store and buy food. People wanted jobs. They didn't want handouts.
That's right. At that same Stanford Inequality Conference, Sean Reardon, who's a professor there, put up a graph that showed that the inequality between rich and poor is at the all-time highest it's ever been in our country. And that is really, and there's only one country that is more unequal than ours, and that's Chile. And Chile became that way using market-based approaches to education over the last several decades. Milton Friedman went to Chile and said, look, we're going to create markets for schools. We're going to have private schools. We're going to have the vouchers. And so the thing is that we know how to do education. You can look at places like Finland and Singapore where they make investments in education. But what we're really trying to do in this country is educate poor children on the cheap. And so in the research literature, whether it be universal pre-K, whether it be hiring teachers that are certified and prepared to teach, there is a whole set of things that we can do that are gold standards in the research literature. We don't have to grasp for straws. We don't have to adopt policies that were created for inequitable reasons in the first place, which is the market-based choice.
Yeah, and maybe we push back against the billionaire monger's statement that McDonald's a great educational facility.
Well, and that's a good point. One of the interesting things is that really the NAACP is the underdog in this conversation. Of course, they agree with Black Lives Matter movement, the coalition of more than 50 groups. They agreed with the ACLU, Southern California, which has been conducting research on charter schools here. They agree with Journey for Justice, but the billions of dollars is on the side of market-based choice. The Gates Foundation has spent $300 million alone on charter schools. Then you have Eli Broad, who is a real estate developer. You have the Walton Family Foundation. these folks have millions and millions of dollars, and they're putting it to work on behalf of charter schools. They're also spending lots of money on Teach for America, who staff these charter schools. 1/3 of all Teach for America teachers who only have 5 weeks of training before they hit the classroom are going into charter schools. And so there's really a cabal. There's a really interesting book by a professor at the University of Michigan called Policy Patrons. And it talks about how there are millions and millions of dollars behind this market-based choice. There are people that really believe that our system of education should be privately controlled instead of have democratic control and public control.
Yeah, it takes me back to something my grandfather always said. He said, if a rich guy's going to take a buck out of his pocket to tell you don't need something, you better spend two to get it, because he understands return on investment. So when I hear the Gates and all them spending money, kind of makes me think I want to go the other way. But Julian, I appreciate you taking some time for us. Great talking with you. I appreciate it and look forward to having you back again.
Great. Thanks for having me on, Rick.
Always great. Julian Vasquez Heilig. If you want to check out his article, we've got a link at thericksmithshow.com. Just click on Julian's name. Take you right there. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
Red roses too. I see them blue for me and you. And I say to myself, what a wonderful world.
Yes, it is all about the children, even after they're born. Rick Smith.